Welcome everyone to another week of Ramban ala Parsha. This week, not just a new Sedra, but a new Sefer Devarim. And as we saw last year, but we'll see slightly differently this year, the Ramban has an introduction to Sefer Devarim. And there, I think, having done this for a while, there are things we can notice that we didn't see last year. First of all, the Ramban focuses on mitzvos. He doesn't really focus on the narrative. Obviously, we call it Mishneh Torah, but everybody realizes it's not Mishneh Torah. The idea that this is a recap of the Sefarim that came before it is clearly not true. There's nothing about Bereshis. There's almost nothing about Shmos. There's some overlap with Vayikra. More with, it's not Mishneh Torah, right? But it is something unique, and it's Moshe's perspective on events that have happened in the past. And there are certain mitzvot, and the Ramban is first focused on the mitzvot, and he says, here are the mitzvot that have never been mentioned in the Torah before. I don't think it's an exclusive list. He says, Hayibum, V'din motzi shemra, V'hagerushin bi'isha, V'edim zomim, V'zulatan. Ramban, those are mitzvahs. You look all over the Torah, and they don't exist. Okay? Ukfan. Now, what does that mean about the mitzvahs? So the first thing the Ramban says is, you should know, there are no new mitzvot given in Arvot Moav. Anything Moshe tells Klal Yisrael in Sefer Devarim is something that he got in the first or second year at Har Sinai or Ol Moed. And here's the Ramban's language. Ukfar ne'emru lo kulan b'Sinai, o b'Ol Moed b'shana harishona, kodem ha-Meraglim. It all happened before the Meraglim. Ki ba'arvot Moav lo nidchadshu lo ela divrei habrit kasher nitparish bo. Arvot Moav are not new mitzvot. It's a new covenant. That's true. But there's no new mitzvot. Va'al kain, and is an amazing insight the Ramban has. Va'al kain, lo ne'emar b'sefer hazeh vayidaber Hashem al Moshe lemor, tzavet b'nei Israel, o daber el b'nei Israel va'amar te'el mitzvah plonit. Ramban says, it doesn't exist in Sefer Devarim, the most popular pasuk in the Torah. I think it's 83 times. Don't check it and don't count. But Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe lemor, right? Over and over again. Says Ramban, you don't find that pasuk in Devarim. And you know why? Because it doesn't happen in Devarim. God is not telling Moshe anything new. Aval lo nichtavu ha-mitzvot b'sfarim harishonim sheyidaber miyotzei Mitzrayim. So obviously the Ramban has to explain. Why would it be that God gave Moshe the mitzvah of Edim Zomimim in Ol Moed in the first year before the Chet HaMeraglim, and Moshe didn't tell it or didn't write it down until the 40th year? So Ramban says, "Aval lo nichtavu ha-mitzvot b'sfarim harishonim sheyidaber miyotzei Mitzrayim, ki ulai lo nahagu ba'otan ha-mitzvot rak ba'aretz, af al pi shehein chovat haguf, ka'asher ba binyan ha-nisachim." So it's fascinating. Says the Ramban, there could be mitzvot, and this I think is becoming more and more of a theme in the Ramban. Obviously the Ramban loved Eretz Israel, and he saw it as different than other aratzot, right? Significantly so. So how would it work? So says the Ramban, it's true. If you ask me about Yibum, I couldn't possibly tell you it's a mitzvah tluya ba'aretz. It's not agricultural. If you ask me about the din of motzi shemra, gerushin, edim zomin, there's nothing about them that make them mitzvahs hatluyos ba'aretz. Except maybe they're really only noheg, or Moshe only felt the need to tell it to Klal Yisrael at the end of 40 years. Right? There could be something we saw last week, for example, at the end of Sefer Bamidbar. So in the Parshios about Arei Miklat. So the Ramban, the pasuk says, "V'lo tikchu kofer lanus alir miklato lo shuv lo shevet ba'aretz ad mot hakohen, v'lo tachanifu et ha'aretz asher atem ba, ki hadam hu yachanif et ha'aretz, v'la'aretz lo yichupar ladam asher shupach ba ki im b'dam shovcho, v'lo titameh et ha'aretz asher atem yoshvim ba asher ani shochen b'tocha, ki ani Hashem shochen b'toch b'nei Israel." And the Ramban there said, it's not a mitzvah hatluya ba'aretz. Avodah zarah, gilui arayos, shvichas dam. They're not mitzvah hatluya ba'aretz, but they're more offensive to HaKadosh Baruch Hu if they happen in Eretz Israel than if they happen in Chutz La'aretz. V'lo tachanifu et haaretz. It's some kind of dishonesty, and Eretz Israel is like a living, breathing entity. And so the Ramban here says the same thing. It could be that the mitzvos that Moshe only gave at the end of the 40 years, it's true, they're not mitzvot hatluyos. They're noeg all over the place. But maybe institutionally, edim zomimim, you could argue, right? There's no real edus and court systems in chutz la'aretz. So Moshe Rabbeinu left this until the end of the 40 years. It's hard to know exactly how it would work out. But the Ramban certainly suggests that these mitzvos, yibum, etc., have more applicability and make more of a difference in Eretz Israel than in chutz la'aretz. And there's like this new category of mitzvot that we've seen before. There are mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz, they're just in Eretz Israel, Shemitah, Yovel, etc. There are mitzvot haguf, that work all over the world, but there are mitzvot in between that work all over the world, but particularly so in Eretz Israel. Now, what's interesting is, I guess the pshat is, Rav Chevelle quotes in the footnotes a question that the Radvaz has on this pshat of the Ramban. And he says, it's a good question. She'im tzivahu Hashem bahem daber al bnei Israel v'chi kavash et nevuato 40 shana? Right, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe Rabbeinu in the first year at Har Sinai or at Ohel Moed, daber al bnei Israel v'amarta alehem, etc., Moshe was kovesh his nevuah. Moshe pushed aside or refused to deliver this nevuah for 40 years. The Radvaz doesn't like that. And it's a fair question, right? It's an Isser Dorais to be kovesh nevuato. If God tells you something and he tells you to tell it to Klal Yisrael, whether he tells you one little nevuah or all of Sefer Devarim or all of Sefer Bamidbar, you have to do it. So I thought to myself, and I don't know if this is 100% true, but why can't it be that Moshe Rabbeinu did give these mitzvos to Klal Yisrael in the second year, in the third year, in the fourth year, but they don't appear in the Torah until Moshe Rabbeinu wrote it down. And Moshe Rabbeinu didn't write anything down from Chet HaMeraglim, let's say, until the 40th year. But, what they do every day in the Midbar. Moshe gave them, they didn't watch they didn't have TV, they didn't watch the internet, they didn't have anything to do. They learned Torah. And who's to say, I suggest, that the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu only wrote these mitzvot in Sefer Devarim means that Bnei Israel never heard these mitzvot before. It could be that Moshe Rabbeinu taught them these mitzvot, but he only wrote it down in Sefer Devarim, right? That might have to do with the machlokes Tanoim and Amoram and Rishonim about, was the Torah given Megillot, right, a little bit at a time, or Chatuma Nitna, the Torah was given, in one complete gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Klal Yisrael. Okay, so certainly I don't know that the Ramban thinks that, but I know the Ramban thinks these mitzvot were given in Sefer Devarim, not before, and he thinks nothing new was given in Sefer Devarim. Everything was told to Moshe Rabbeinu at the beginning of the 40 years, either at Har Sinai or in Ohel Moed immediately after Har Sinai, but before the Chet HaMeraglim. And after the Chet HaMeraglim, there was nothing for 38 and a half years. Okay, so that's the first point in the Ramban here, that you shouldn't think that Moshe Rabbeinu is telling over nevuos to Klal Yisrael now that he just got. He didn't get anything in Arvot Moav. Okay, and then the Ramban points out something obvious. Another possibility. O mipnei sheinan tidirot lo hizkiram mak bibnei nocha lehaaretz. Okay, or maybe they just don't happen that often. Edim zomim, gerishin, yibum. Maybe it doesn't happen that often, so it's only told to the ba'ei haaretz. Now the Ramban continues as to Sefer Devarim, and he says, V'terem sheyatchil bibiur haTorah. Before Moshe Rabbeinu starts explaining fundamental messages of the Torah, which is really what Sefer Devarim is about, hitchil lahochicham ulahazkil lahem avonotehem, kama yamruhu bamidbar v'kama hitnahegi mohem hakadosh baruch hu b'midat harachamim. Says the Ramban, before Moshe gets to the mitzvot, and as we've discussed before and we'll discuss again, right? Mefarshim sees, certainly Ramban sees 3 speeches in Sefer Devarim. There's the first speech that takes all of Parshat Devarim and the first little bit of Va'et Chanan, and you can see it inside. If you look in a Chumash, you'll see the new Dibur of Moshe, as if that first introductory speech was finished. That sort of recaps major events that happened at the beginning of the Midbar. And the Ramban says the reason Moshe is doing this is because Bnei Yisrael should know two things. One, they sinned. Two, HaKadosh Baruch Hu deals with them b'midat harachamim. And this is a significant point for the Ramban. V'zeh lahodia chasadav imahem. Va'od. Sheyuchechu bidvarav shelo yachzru lekilkulam pen yisvu b'chal chatotam. Okay, any musar is, this is what your fathers did. You don't do that. Ulechazek libam bahodia otam ki b'midat rachamim yitnaheg imahem la'olam. The Ramban says HaKadosh Baruch Hu is strengthening their will and strengthening their self-confidence and their belief in themselves that they won't sin by saying HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to always deal with them b'midat harachamim. Shelo yomar adam lo yuchal lareshet et haaretz ki ein adam asher lo yechta. I know I'm going to sin. We all know we're going to sin. So what's the point? I'll never get to go into Eretz Israel. I'll never be able to be forgiven by God. Umiyat tiyeh midat hadin mitucha kinegdo v'nevad. If I sin, God's going to punish me, and I'll be lost. V'lachein hodiyam Moshe Rabbeinu ki hakadosh baruch hu rachaman malei rachamim. No, Moshe Rabbeinu is reintroducing Bnei Yisrael to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he's saying all of these things happened, and you're still here. You rejected HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right? You attacked Eretz Israel for no reason. Hashem said not to. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Rachaman Malei Rachamim. Ki haslicha v'hamechila mimenu yitbarach siyua ve'ezer livnei adam ba'avodato. God's midah of Rachamim helps people. Because once you know that God is, it doesn't mean you won't be punished. The Chet HaMeraglim caused the punishment. It's true. But the punishment wasn't you're not going to get to go into Eretz Israel. The punishment, you have to wait. So he says the same thing. When Moshe Rabbeinu tells them, these are the things you did wrong, and God is a Melech Rachaman, they're going to believe that even if they sin again, they're going to be able to go into Eretz Israel. Uki inyan shamar katuv, ki imecha hasilicha leman tivarei. Leman tivarei, bishvil litain amitcha al briotacha, meaning I believe that if I worship HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I'm going to be successful. I know that I'm going to sin. I also know on some level that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to forgive me. There are sins that maybe are unforgivable. But says the Ramban, the point of recounting the sins of Klal Yisrael is not just tochacha. It's also to let people know that despite these things, you're going into Eretz Israel, and you should know going forward, even if you trip up, even if you slip up, even if you make a mistake, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a Melech Rachaman. And the Ramban feels that deeply, and that's the message that he gives in the introduction to Sefer Devarim. Okay, let's just do two more pieces in the Parsha that I find fascinating. The first is at the end of Perek Aleph. It's Pasuk Lamed Zayin. And the Torah in Moshe telling over the story says as follows, as part of Chet HaMeraglim, Gam bi hitanaf Hashem biglalchem lemor gam atalot havosham. Right, something we know is not true. Moshe Rabbeinu says, because of the sin of Meraglim, you caused me to sin, and when you caused me to sin, I can now not go into Eretz Israel. Now, the Torah, if there's one point that HaKadosh Baruch Hu goes out of his way to stress, it's that Moshe Rabbeinu's punishment was not from Chet HaMeraglim. Moshe Rabbeinu's punishment was the fact that he hit the rock. And it had nothing to do with Chet HaMeraglim. So why is Moshe saying now to Klal Yisrael, trying to pass off the blame to them in a way that's not really true? Okay, so it happens to be that the Chet HaMeraglim is slightly more complicated than we think. And there's really one of these amazing lines here when Moshe Rabbeinu is telling us about the Chet HaMeraglim. And he says, I sent them, here it is. He says, Bnei Israel came to me. V'atikvun elai kulchem v'atamu nishlecha anashim lefaninu v'yachpu lanu et haaretz v'yashivu otonu davar taderech Hashem na'al leba v'eit ha'arim Hashem navo alehem. The next pasuk, I think, is one of the most amazing psukim ever. Says Moshe, 38 and a half years later, knowing what the punishment for Chet HaMeraglim was, Moshe says, Vayitav be'einai hadavar. I thought it was a good idea. It's an amazing admission by Moshe Rabbeinu. Knowing all the bad things that happened because of Chet HaMeraglim, Moshe says, God, tell you the truth. I thought it was a good idea. It didn't work out. In the end, it turned out to be tragic, but I thought it was a good idea. Okay, now back to us. What does Moshe Rabbeinu mean when he says to Bnei Israel that it's because of you that I'm not going into Eretz Israel? So, says the Ramban, Gam bihi tanaf Hashem biglalchem, Yomar, Hine chatatchem asher asitem ba'etahi b'meraglim, manu mikem haaretz hatova. You, or your parents, literally, were prohibited from going into Eretz Israel because of the Chet HaMeraglim. Va'od hosaftem lachet b'pa'am acheret ad shemnatem gamoti mila'avor. The Ramban says what Moshe is doing now is talking to Klal Yisrael about the people who are not allowed into Eretz Israel. It's not the cause. Meraglim, which I just finished talking about, says Moshe, that's the reason you're not allowed to go in. I'm not allowed to go in because of the Chet of Mei Merivah. But now's the time in the Torah that we're talking about the people who are not permitted to go into Eretz Israel. Ki ratzah lahazkir yachad onesh kol hanimna'im me'avor el haaretz. He wanted to cover everybody who was prohibited entry into Eretz Israel. Ki hakol bigramat avonotehem. Right? The why and which sin is less important than the fact that you need to know there are standards for entry into Eretz Israel, everybody their own standard, and we failed that standard. Ukidei sheyazkir kan inyan Yehoshua ki hu ya'avor mipanai shemileh achrei Hashem kichavero, like Kalev. He said the other reason it has to be mentioned here is because the people need to understand why Yoshua is taking over from Moshe. So he says Yoshua made a name for himself when he and Kalev opposed the other Meraglim. V'yizkeod she'anchil ha'aretz l'dor hasheni ba'avur she'ne'enash Moshe v'nigzar alav shelo ya'avor. Right, I was punished. I can't go into Eretz Yisrael, but Yoshua will take you. V'hinei hizkir kol ha'ma'asahu zulati magefat ha'meraglim atzmam. The Ramban, because he's a careful reader, recognizes this. That Moshe Rabbeinu here doesn't ever mention the Magefa that killed the Meraglim. V'gam lo hizkir hadiba. He doesn't really talk about the Lashon Hara. It's the tamtzit of what happened when Chet HaMeraglim occurred, but without the details. Ki lo yidaber bignai hayechidim. He's not trying to insult any of the individuals. Aval yochech et harabim shekulam chatu v'kulam ne'enshu. Okay, so far, the reason why Moshe Rabbeinu says, Gam bihi tanaf Hashem biglalchem lemor, is not because he was punished for the Chet HaMeraglim. He wasn't. But Moshe Rabbeinu at this point is talking about all the people who are not allowed in for the various sins, and therefore he includes himself in it. But the Ramban continues, V'ta'am biglalchem. What does it mean when Moshe says, oh, God was also angry at me because of you? Which sounds a little bit like he's passing the buck. Ki ravu b'nei Yisrael et Hashem. No, the chet of Mei Merivah was b'nei Yisrael fighting with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'ira kol zeh ba'avur merivatchem. Had you not complained about the water situation, it never would have happened. That's one possible answer. O yirmoz shehaya hakas al Moshe v'al Aaron kasher hiku asela pa'amayim lifnei ha'am v'lo asu kasher nitztavu. Right? The whole Aveira was they hit the rock and they didn't do what they were commanded to do. V'ha'am hir haru b'davar. But now the Ramban says something new, something he didn't say back then. He says when they hit the rock, the people were less convinced. Right? They still had doubts. Was it HaKadosh Baruch Hu? V'hu ma she'amar al asher lo kidashtem oti b'toch b'nei Yisrael shelo haya ha'onesh ela mipnei shaya hadavar b'toch b'nei Yisrael shelo nitkadesh hakavod le'eineihem. Says the Ramban, it's really a fascinating idea. Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron were punished because they didn't make a Kiddush Hashem. But they didn't make a Kiddush Hashem because Bnei Israel didn't accept it. Right? Literally, a Kiddush Hashem is, result-oriented. Did they do something that all the people standing around them thought to themselves, wow, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is really great? That's literally a Kiddush Hashem. And Moshe says, if you ask me, if I went and somebody hit a rock and the water gushed out, I would believe it's a miracle. So Moshe is saying, V'gam bihi tanav Hashem biglalchem lemor, because you didn't believe it was a miracle. You weren't impressed when I hit the rock. And so it was your lack of being impressed that created Ya'an lo amanti mi lahakdisheni b'mei meriva. Why was it not a Kiddush Hashem? Because all of Klal Yisrael was standing around and they didn't view it as a Kiddush Hashem. Had they viewed it as a Kiddush Hashem, it would have been. And implied in that is Moshe Rabbeinu saying, had you viewed it as a Kiddush Hashem, I would be leading you into Eretz Israel now. So it is true in the second answer of the Ramban, it is your fault. Gam bihi tanav Hashem biglalchem lemor, literally because of you. Why? So on some level, because you complained. So that's how we got into the whole problem to begin with. But more significantly, it's because the lack of Kiddush Hashem that I created was your fault. It should have been, and it could have been a Kiddush Hashem. You didn't view it that way. You have extremely high standards of Kiddush Hashem. And so since you, Bnei Yisrael, didn't view it that way, HaKadosh Baruch Hu punished me. Right? It's a fascinating idea, and it really speaks to the subjectivity of a Kiddush Hashem. Sometimes, and of course, sadly, a Chilul Hashem, right? Sometimes I do something, and people want to see the good in me, and they want to love HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and they see it as a Kiddush Hashem. And maybe I get credit for it, maybe we get credit for it. But sometimes we do things, and the people don't see it that way. Okay, so it's true, it's not binary. It's not like, if you didn't do a Kiddush Hashem, God forbid you did a Chilul Hashem. That's not the case. That's not the halacha. That's not the philosophy. That's not the hashkafa. But it's a missed opportunity, right? And Moshe Rabbeinu was punished for the missed opportunity of the Kiddush Hashem that would have taken place had he spoken to the rock. Okay, that's number 2 in the parsha. Number 3. It's towards the end of the parsha. And the pasuk says as follows: Perek Bet, pasuk Chav Hey. Says the Torah: Kumu se'u v'ivru at nachal Arnon, re'ei natati biyadcha et Sichon melech Heshbon ha'emori ve'et artzo achel rosh, v'hitgar bo milchama. Okay? Hayom hazeh achel teit pachtecha v'yiratecha al pnei ha'amim tachat kol hashamayim, asher yishme'un shim'acha v'ragizu v'chalu mipanecha. Right? It's hard just in the pshat of the psukim, it's hard not to see, part of the sin of the Meraglim was what? Vanihi be'einenu kachagavim v'chein hayinu be'einehem. Right? They saw us as grasshoppers, so we saw ourselves that way. Right? It's like a lack of self-confidence. Now the Torah tells us, don't worry about it. They're terrified of you. Hayom hazeh achel teit pachtecha v'yadcha al pnei ha'amim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not going to allow another situation of Vanhi beinenu kachagavim. Rather, he's going to say, I'm telling you now, they're terrified. Asher yishmun shimachav ragzu v'chalu mipanecha. They are terrified of you. And says the Ramban, V'ta'am achel teit pachtecha kineged Yisrael shiyirum kol ha'amim. Right? Who is achel teit pachtecha? So in the context of the psukim, it could be Moshe Rabbeinu, who's been talking for the last 17 or so psukim. So God could be saying, Moshe Rabbeinu, I made Bnei Israel fear you. Or it could be, no, the Gentiles, the Yoshvei Haaretz, are going to fear Bnei Israel. So the Ramban immediately says, no, it's talking about Kineged Yisrael, as we said. Kineged Yisrael, Shirum Kol Amim. The nations are going to fear Bnei Yisrael. V'anshei Kinan belev names yatzuli kratam. Right? Names literally means melted. Right? They went out to fight us, but not with a full heart. It's like when the Meraglim met Rachav in Yericho, and she says, everybody's terrified of you. They knew this in advance. Aval hiksha Hashem et rucham leimar tov mutenu becharbam milihiyot lahem avadim. Strange insight of the Ramban. The Ramban says the Yoshvei Haaretz knew they were going to lose. They went out without any sense of confidence. Then the obvious question is, so why didn't they just make peace? Why didn't they just give in? So says the Ramban, no. They thought to themselves, we would rather be killed than be slaves to Bnei Israel. That's a whole separate topic. What would we gain by saying what God gained by saying, oh Moshe Rabbeinu, nowadays everybody's afraid of you. Moshe Rabbeinu never entered Israel, Eretz Israel proper. Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't Ever Hayarden. It wasn't going to help Bnei Israel win a war. Aval hi haftacha liYisrael v'liYehoshua ka'asher amalo einecha haraot v'zetam hachel rosh lareshet et artzo. You're going to have an easy time conquering the land because they're terrified of you. Not of Moshe Rabbeinu. They're terrified of Am Yisrael, led by Yehoshua bin Nun. They're terrified of the new generation, and it's not going to be a problem for you to conquer the land. And you never need to think to yourself, Vanihi beinenu kachagavim v'chein hayinu be'eineihem. Okay, so we did 3 Rambans today. The first was the fascinating introduction of Ramban to Sefer Devarim, where he tells you as a fact that anything that Moshe says in Devarim, any mitzvot that he gives Bnei Israel, were given to him kfar at Ohel Moed or at Har Sinai. That's why the pasuk of Vayidaber Hashem Moshe Lemor never appears in Sefer Devarim. We saw the Gambi Hitanaf Hashem Biglalchem Lemor. He's not blaming them. He's telling them, had you been impressed, had it been a Kiddush Hashem when I hit the rock, everything would be good. But since you weren't, since you were not impressed, it's Biglalchem that I'm being punished. And finally, the one we just did, God is not going to allow what happened before. He's telling Bnei Israel in advance, the people who live in Eretz Israel are terrified of you. Don't worry about it. It's not Moshe Rabbeinu they're terrified of you, and winning will be easy. Okay, those are the 3 Rambans for today. Hope you enjoyed. Yashkach to everybody, Shabbat Shalom, and see you, God willing, next week.